So we are on number 5323. We're going through the objections. So instance, both powers must be kept within their limits, but the system which does this is the one which is expressed by the formula of free church in a free state. Therefore, this system is true. I distinguish the major. Both powers must be kept within their natural limits, that is, their true limits I concede, their naturalistic limits I deny. Men are ordered to a higher end. St. Thomas says, it is incumbent upon each man to accomplish something which is ordered to something else as toward an end, and he must make sure that his work is in keeping with the end. See, so everything we do in view of an end, and therefore that's precisely what conscience is to determine that what we are doing is in accordance with the good end. So, yes?
Your Excellency, a free church and a free state, is that laminate?
I don't know if he said that, but it is laminate. In other words, he was reacting, don't forget, to the Restoration, where the Bourbons came back and were Gallicans again, and so I mean, it's something like Feeney, who was reacting to the leftist ecumenism of Cushing, but then they fall into an error. You see, so he was saying that instead of is known as throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Instead of saying the Bourbon monarchy was excessive in its oppression of its impositions on the church. Therefore, we need a church completely free of the government. Well, that's ridiculous. But he was a liberal. He was a person that was imbued with liberal ideas, French Revolution ideas. He eventually apostatized. That's Félicité de Lamennais. He had a brother who was quite pious and who edited the French version of The Imitation of Christ. So don't get them mixed up. That was you might say the point of departure, and also there was the United States. You see, what was going on in the United States had an influence on liberals in Europe. See, so the American experiment of completely freeing the church from government, government from the church, etc., seemed to work well. You see, the church was free; it could do whatever it wanted. You see, and therefore, that's the ideal system. That's a per accidens good effect, but it's not the ideal system. And also, America was a completely different place from France because it had all sorts of religions in it, whereas France was predominantly Catholic. See, so but he was. He also was very ultramontane. In other words, that. Look to the Pope for the unity of the church, not the French government, which of course is good, but again, it was like a train with a lot of bizarre cars following it. It was a lot of things that were inconsistent, and but it was liberal. O'Connell, the famous Daniel O'Connell, was in with that. It was liberal Catholicism of the 19th century, which is one of the early forms of modernism. Modernism is, in one sentence, we have to adapt the Catholic Church to the modern world, and it called for the adaptation of the church to the modern world, and that can be done in many ways. But the first way was in this question of church and state. Montalembert, Lacordaire, bunch of others. Those are the principal characters. Some in Germany too, but they eventually turned out a Lacordaire not turned out better, I would say. But still, I mean, he was the one that said, I want to die a liberal and all that. You know, that, in other words, they were very doctrinaire about their liberalism. And it was a mentality. Remember that liberalism is a mentality and modernism is a mentality. It starts with a mentality and then it produces fruit. See, liberalism is, if the mentality of liberalism is that if there is something there, we must compromise with it. We must live with it. We must in some way incorporate it into our thinking. That's the mentality of liberalism. And the person who pointed that out was a famous French Benedictine, Dombes. Wrote a whole book about liberalism. That it starts with that. That it is impossible to reject it. See, if it's there, if society has produced a mentality or a movement, somehow the church must adapt to it. That's liberalism. Modernism is just the same principle, but with regard to modern philosophy and modern ideas about religion that come out of the 18th century thinking. It's the same thing. You see that, well, it's there. So we have to incorporate it somehow, and we have to relate to modern man. And the Catholic Church will be rejected if we don't dilute, if we don't take it out of the Middle Ages and the Baroque period, the Tridentine period. So it's a mentality first, and then it can produce anything. Because if anything shows up, you have to compromise with it. You have to, in some way, work it into the Catholic religion. So you saw that. I don't know if that answers your question. But a free church and a free state. It's a book about, but I think it comes from him, Bishop England of Charleston, North Carolina, who was also a liberal. I'm wondering if that's where Lamennais got it, because he wrote a whole tract on this thing about the blessings of a free church and a free state. Bishop England, not to be confused with Bishop Ireland, who was much later. This is 1830s. And if I'm not mistaken, Cardinal Gibbons came from his diocese. I'm almost certain he did. He was described by Benigni, not Bunigny, but Benigni, for the 1914, the next election. You see, he put out a list of the cardinals and a rating on each one. His was Vieux libéral américain. And it was absolutely true. That's Benigni's opinion of Gibbons. Yes? Old. He was ancient by then. Gibbons was ancient. This was written about 1912 or 13. I can't remember when he died, but he was antique by that point. And so that was his determination of Gibbons, was vieux libéral américain, old American liberal. And it infected the church in America badly. The German clergy were against it. The liberalism came from the Irish clergy. 19th century in this country. The Germans were against it. But the Irish learned liberalism from their struggle against England, because England gave them religious freedom in the 1829 based on liberal principles. Daniel O'Connell, who was a super liberal. So the Irish were imbued with liberal principles that this is a good thing. You know, that free church and a free state is a wonderful thing. So the Irish were infected by it for the most part. I mean, there were exceptions. And there were exceptions among the German clergy too. But as a rule, the German clergy were dead against it. See, so that's when you're looking at the history of modernism, you have to look at the history of the mentality first before you look into the actual, the fruit of that mentality. And it goes back to, in my opinion, you know, of course, I think it goes back to Pius VII and the Concordat. My opinion. But that's just an opinion. That changed. Pius VI was dead against the French Revolution. He died in 1799. 1800, he is elected as a liberal, as someone who will baptize the revolution, because his ideas were well known before. If you look at the history of Pius VII, even, you know, in his early priesthood and all in the 18th century, he expounded views that were you would consider liberal. And he was elected for that, to somehow make peace with the revolution in France. And that's what he did. And you know, the rest is history. But I think he started that mentality that somehow we can live with this, and somehow the church can I mean, he would never have consented to what's going on today, but the mentality is there. That if it's there, we have to, in some way, accommodate to it. Whereas the other mentality was, this is something from hell, and we have to condemn it. Those are the two currents in the church since 1800. You could even go back more so even to Benedict XIV, 1750s, who made compromises with the Freemasonic and liberal and you know, everything else courts of Europe, all the courts, the big courts of Europe, France, Spain, Austria, and the other one, another big one, can't remember, the Portugal, were all infected with Jansenism and revolutionary ideas. All of them infected. And his point was, well, the church has to survive in this, you know. But his cardinals were very much opposed to his policies. His advising cardinals in Rome were very much opposed to his policies. So and not that he was a liberal, it's just that it's that idea, how do we deal with this? And I'm sure at the time they thought that was the prudent path. But they did implant a mentality in certain Catholics and the clergy that became very, very dangerous. Just a theory. But and I'm sure Pius, all of these people were excellent and high intention. And it's just, how do you deal with this problem? You know, here's a monster in France. Now what do we do? It's like the Putin of 1800. What do we do with this creature in France who is, you know, ready to invade all of Europe and spread the manure of the French Revolution all over Europe, etc.? What do we do with this revolution in France? So, but that's really, in you know, grosso modo, the history of the church since I would say 250 years. And as the world became more and more liberal and apostate, the mentality grew and grew, and somehow, the church is living in the Middle Ages, and it's got to get out, and this is what you have today. So, and I don't know, does that answer your question? We said St. Thomas, the system of a free church in a free state, which in the sense of the adversaries is not a liberty with concord, but a separation of the powers, which is contrary to this order of things, since it per se recedes from it entirely in such a way that the divorce of the state from the church is approved, the separation of the state from God and Jesus Christ. So it's entirely disordered. It's intrinsically disordered. Finally, it is the profanation of the entire civil society, meaning the civil society is entirely secularistic. There is no religion officially whatsoever in civil society. That's what it means, profanation. In other words, it makes it profane. There is no sacred character at all in society. Objection 3, to have conflicts is evil. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. But the union of the powers generates perpetual conflicts. Therefore, this union has nothing to make it desirable. Response, I distinguish the major conflict is a certain evil I concede, always the greatest evil I deny. I distinguish the minor, the union of the powers generates perpetual conflicts, and per se I deny. Some conflicts and per accidens I subdistinguish, which were a lesser evil than separation I concede, a greater evil I deny. So yes, there were conflicts. Famous conflict of Philip the Fair and Boniface VIII, where Philip the Fair wanted to tax the monasteries for his military campaigns. And Boniface VIII said, no, you can't. See that? Sure. Even a husband and wife who love each other dearly, when they're living in the same house, there's going to be some conflict. It's almost impossible. And each one has his or her own interests, and it's almost impossible that there not be some conflict. But that doesn't mean we should get rid of marriage. I mean, that's just human nature. Those evils must be chosen which are lesser, since on earth it is impossible to avoid all evils. But the separation per se takes away the good of peace, and besides adduces the evil of conflict. But union, which is in conformity with the nature of each society per se, favors peace. There were many more occasions for dispute than for union. For example, matrimony violated by the kings, or by the invasion of ecclesiastical goods. If, however, per accidens there were some disputes which arose from the system of union of church and state, this evil cannot be compared with the good things which a Christian constitution of states brings to peoples. So, and in one of his encyclicals, it may have been Longínqua, or the one condemning Americanism, but I think it was in Longínqua. Leo XIII said, yes, your system in America gives liberty to the church, but don't think that that is going to, in the long run, benefit the church. He said something to that effect. That this is not some ideal system. Because once the state becomes more and more profane, and we're seeing exactly that, once it falls more and more into the effects of original sin, having no guidance from religion, it's going to oppose the church. That's exactly what we're seeing. And even where the church is totally separate in this country, There are conflicts. It's not without its conflicts. Where those limitations are. Because human beings are body and soul in one thing. Instance, the history of the Middle Ages is full of trickery and violence on the part of rulers against the church. Therefore, the system of union seems to be only a utopia. Response, I distinguish the antecedent. This is true concerning all of the rulers, I deny. Concerning some, I subdistinguish. This type of vice affected the persons of the rulers, I concede, arose from the Christian constitution of states, I again distinguish. Per se, I deny, and sometimes per accidens, I concede. So yes, the big problem in the Middle Ages for the church was some monarchs interfering in the church and exceeding their royal powers, because the church was enormously powerful. For one thing, it controlled a lot of land. Secondly, it was an enormous moral force. And so they were very concerned about controlling the church and appointing their buddies. See, that was the case, for example, Henry II in England. He did appoint his buddy, but his buddy turned on him. That was St. Thomas of Becket. He was supposed to be a good little puppy dog for the king, but things went the wrong way. But they always wanted bishops that would be docile to them, and that was a big problem in the Middle Ages. And it started ultimately with Constantine, because the church had no freedom before Constantine. It was persecuted. But with Constantine, that problem started to become more and more difficult. You see St. John Chrysostom, who was a victim of that Caesaro-papism in Constantinople, etc. And where the bishops in that empire were excessively controlled by the emperor. It is completely false that all of the rulers attacked the church, since in nearly all of the kingdoms of Europe, the civilization was founded by some saintly, canonized king, or certainly by rulers who were amicably united to the church or to the Roman pontiff. It is indeed certain that many rulers had conflicts, but the conflicting parties were not able and did not dare to subvert the Christian constitution of their kingdoms. Life went on. In other words, Christian Europe remained Christian, and nobody subverted that idea. That they misbehaved in various ways, yes. But don't forget, people died younger in those days than they do now, so you could always hope for the best. Or, they might get an arrow in their heart in some battle. You never know. So it happened to Richard the Lionhearted. He was fighting in France over something, and somebody gave him an arrow right in the heart and died. So these very kingdoms had been constituted upon the principle of union of church and state. Hence often there was a struggle on behalf of the church, either by the peoples themselves or by the rulers, mindful of their duty against public enemies. In brief, there was no greater obstacle to the tyrant and the persecutor than the Christian constitution of his kingdom. For this reason, Leo XIII said, "There was once a time when states were governed by the philosophy of the gospel. Then it was that the power and divine virtue of Christian wisdom had diffused itself throughout the laws, the institutions, the morals of the people, permeating all ranks and relations of civil society. See, the whole thing was Catholic. Then to the religion instituted by Jesus Christ, established firmly in befitting dignity, flourished everywhere by the favor of princes and the legitimate protection of magistrates. And church and state were happily united in concord and friendly interchange of good offices. The state constituted in this wise, and that means in this way, bore fruits important beyond all expectation, whose remembrance is still and always will be in renown, witnessed to as they are by countless proofs, which can never be blotted out or ever obscured by any craft of any enemies. Referring to Freemasons. Christian Europe has subdued barbarous nations and changed them from a savage to a civilized condition, from superstition to true worship. All right, so that's the Church's teaching on union of church and state. That's important, especially for in these times when separation of church and state is considered an ideal. It isn't. It's condemned, actually, by the Catholic Church. Article 5, whether the church has an indirect power over temporal things, the status questionis. We are speaking here about indirect power, which is exercised not within the limits of the same power, but over a distinct power, independent of its own order, but which is connected to the first in some respect. And so the rule remains, each one is supreme in his own genus. We're talking about church and state. And just as the state has no power over the sacraments or the institution of bishops, so the spiritual power does not take care of the creation of army officers or the selecting of the best type of weapons or of other merely temporal matters. You know, we think you need more nukes. It concerns a true power which must be obeyed. To assign to the church a mere higher grade of honor or of excellence is not sufficient. Nor are we speaking about temporal power, which the Roman pontiff exercised over his own lands, or in certain regions which subjected themselves to him by their own accord, or by the positive laws of nations. England gave itself to the Roman pontiff in the Middle Ages. England became a fiefdom of the Pope by some monarch, and I forget who it was. So we will treat about that power over temporal things which pertains to the successor of Peter by divine right. For that power in view of this proximate end is spiritual. It directly and spiritually directs spiritual things. It directs temporal things only to the extent that the supernatural end requires it. Therefore, we ask whether the divine right, by divine right, a power over temporal things pertains to the church, besides the fullness of power over spiritual things. This would be an indirect power, that is, as it is ordered to spiritual things, greater than a directive power, but lesser than a direct power. So we'll see what that means. The question must be solved by the ultimate end of man. The order of societies is known from the ultimate end. Therefore, the ultimate end of man must be more intensely considered in order to more easily arrive at conclusions. But the ultimate end of both individuals and of the whole multitude is outside of the limits of civil society. See, civil society cannot provide everything that human beings need. For it is necessary that men tend in such a way that by living a virtuous life they arrive at the enjoyment of God. For this reason, St. Thomas says, it is a certain good extraneous to man while he is living in mortal life, namely ultimate beatitude, which is expected in the enjoyment of God after death, because as St. Paul says in Corinthians, while we are in the body, we are absent from the Lord. And for the Christian man, that beatitude is required by the blood of Christ. and the Christian has received the pledge of the Holy Ghost in order to obtain it. Man does not attain this end through human power, but by divine power, according to the verse of St. Paul, the grace of God, life eternal. Therefore, to arrive at this end does not pertain to human government, but to divine government. The administration of the spiritual kingdom, therefore, in order that spiritual things be distinct from terrestrial things, has been committed not to terrestrial kings, but to priests, and principally to the Roman pontiff, to whom all kings of the Christian people must be subject, as if to the Lord Jesus Christ. So to him, to whom the care of ultimate end pertains, they must be subject, who have the care of inferior ends, and to be directed by this power. Right, so that's the general principle, is that the spiritual end is higher than the temporal end, and therefore where there is conflict or any kind of question of which is superior, the spiritual end is superior, and therefore the church is superior to the state in that regard. That's the general principle. So the adversaries, they should be directly refuted who admit no power of the church over temporal matters, namely the authors and promoters of the Declaration of the Gallican Church, 1682. So the king, in which it claims that by divine right princes are subject to no ecclesiastical power in temporal matters. For a greater reason, the thesis attacks those who withdraw from the jurisdiction of the church kings and other Christian princes in the very spiritual and ecclesiastical affairs. Indirectly, the thesis refutes the systems of direct power and of merely directive power. So it makes the state higher than the church and controlling of the church. So the church has indirect power over temporal things. Arguments. The indirect power of the church over temporal things is a power over temporal things as they are ordered to a supernatural end. But there is no doubt that power, in the true sense of the term, over temporal things as they are ordered to a supernatural end, pertains by divine right to the church. Therefore, an indirect power over temporal things pertains to the church. Proof of the minor. They who have care of antecedent ends must be subject to him who has care of the ultimate end, and they must be directed by his power. General philosophical principle. In other words, the people who are on the assembly line at a car factory are subject to the ultimate management of the company. See, they are in the antecedent process, but they cannot decide how to make the car or do anything. They have to look to the ultimate end and who governs the ultimate end. Proof of the minor. They who have care of the antecedent ends, okay, we said that, but the care of the ultimate end of man by God's order pertains proximately to the church. Therefore, temporal things, as they are ordered to the supernatural good, which is the ultimate end of man, must be subject to the church. Argument 2, to govern is to lead that which is governed to its due end in a suitable manner. Definition of government and indirectly of authority. However, temporal principality cannot lead peoples in a suitable manner to a due end unless it is subject to the ecclesiastical power with regard to spiritual things. Therefore, the civil power is subordinated to the ecclesiastical power with regard to spiritual things. That is, the church enjoys an indirect power over temporal things. Proof of the minor. The end of man and of the whole multitude of human beings, and consequently of the government of the multitude, is celestial things to which human things are subordinated. But celestial things are confided to the church, Therefore, the civil government to which human beings have been handed over is bound to be subject to the church with regard to the celestial end. Since each power constituted by God must operate toward one ultimate end, there is no doubt that the subordination of one to the other is required, for otherwise peace would be taken away in a conflict of the interests of the temporal and spiritual order, since there would be no judge. But we have proven above that the church is not subordinated to the state. The state, therefore, is subordinated to the church with regard to spiritual things. Sacred Scripture teaches that it is necessary to yield temporal things to supernatural goods. That is, that the civil good is not the ultimate end of man, but is an end under an end. In other words, it's a proximate end under an ultimate end. Therefore, the law of ordering each power according to God's idea is this: for what doth it profit a man if he gain the whole world and suffer the loss of his own soul? So it's obvious and makes sense. It doesn't need a lot of explanation. And then you have the proof from tradition. Although the exercise of the indirect power before the age of Constantine the Great was impeded to a great extent because of, you get put to death, the faithful were nevertheless ordered to support the ministers of the church with temporal goods. St. Paul says that the priest lives by the altar. See, that the priest should not be required to go out and work at a secular job. Christians were forbidden to function in certain civil functions because of oaths they would have to take to gods or to something awful. When the priests and the elders objected the temporal good of the public tranquility to those who were preaching the gospel, the apostles responded that the temporal good must be placed after the spiritual good. We ought to obey God rather than men. That was the response to the Sanhedrin, who called them in. And that's what the SSPX, that's like it's on the flag of recognize and resist. It's like the motto of recognize and resist. We have to obey God rather than men. And Bishop Gerard pointed out that is the whole point of the church, is that it has the power of God and the assistance of God, that you're not obeying men when you are obeying the church. Otherwise, you make the church into something like a Protestant church, or a bunch of people that got together and organized some church thing. The whole idea is that I am with you all days, even to the consummation of the world. You cannot cite that against the church. But that is recognize and resist. So that's like the golden... I remember Archbishop Lefebvre citing that in a conference. And it sounds good, it sounds good to people. Well, he's the Pope, but, he's telling us to do something wrong. He's a bad dad. That's Father Cicada used to say. He used to qualify it that way. He's a bad father. And so he's our father, but it just doesn't work. You destroy the entire nature of the Catholic Church and its assistance by the Spirit of truth by saying that. The only way recognize and resist would work is if a pope gave you a specific command, to do something wrong, but not to the universal church. And you could say, I resist your will because you're telling me to do something wrong. He is quite capable of doing that. Any pope, in the sense that there's no protection. So, if he told you to steal or something like that, you could say no, and he's still the pope. That works, but it doesn't work for the universal practices of the Catholic Church, and its universal laws, its disciplines, its liturgy, its doctrines. It just doesn't work. You put a mentality in Catholics that is ultimately Protestant. I mean, it really doesn't differ from Martin Luther. Because you're saying implicitly that in these matters that pertain to eternal salvation and to the very function of the church has erred. So, it's... but that's what they said to those who were accusing them of disobeying the law. The Apostolic Constitutions, St. John Chrysostom says, many doctors of the Middle Ages compare the order of state and church to that order by which soul and body are joined together. So obviously the soul must direct the body. This heavenly city, this is St. Augustine, then, while it sojourns on earth, calls citizens out of all nations and gathers together a society of pilgrims of all languages, not scrupling about diversities in the manners, laws, and institutions whereby earthly peace is secured and maintained, but recognizing that, however various these are, they all tend to one and the same end of earthly peace. Pope St. Gelasius said, there are two things, August Emperor, by which the world is principally governed, the sacred authority of the pontiffs and the royal authority. Of the two, the greater is the weight of the priests, to the extent that they must render account to God for the very rulers of men. And then Pope St. Symmachus said, we have both, each in our own place, received human powers until they do not set up their will against God. Furthermore, if all power is from God, that power is greater which is placed above divine things. Defer to God with regard to us, and we will defer to God with regard to you. But if you do not defer to God, you cannot use that privilege whose rights you despise. So... I'll let you read the rest on your own. It's specific cases about Boniface VIII, Unam Sanctam, etc. But you understand the principle. Okay, now we get into councils. Did Father Tetra talk about councils in Say? No? A little bit. Okay. Boy, Telegram is really going this morning. Okay, all right. So, the concept of a general council. A council, from the Greek synodos. Hodos in Greek means way, Latin via. Hodos. This is O-D-O-S. Hodos. That means via. So syn means with. So syn hodos means a coming together, essentially. A way with. That's the synod. And the word method comes from that. Meta, according to hodos, according to the way, methodos. Studying Greek is a very good thing to do, so you can do that in your spare time. All right, as a sort of a hobby. It has been called by others a congregation, conventus, synodale concilium, conventus synodalis. It is a coming together of bishops under legitimate authority for the purpose of judging and legislating concerning ecclesiastical affairs. I said of bishops, that is, of judges per se, but a diocesan synod or a meeting of one bishop and his clergy is not contained in the definition. So there would be diocesan synods, even local councils, like of a country or a province, an ecclesiastical province, like the councils of Baltimore. They're not into this. It is added concerning ecclesiastical affairs, that is, concerning matters of faith, morals, or discipline. There are two kinds of councils: general, which we will discuss principally, and two particular, which are subdivided into national, provincial, and diocesan. The first council concerning matters of faith was held in Jerusalem. Councils around the middle of the 2nd century were held in Asia Minor, as Eusebius relates in, that's H.E., the Historia Ecclesiastica. Church history is loaded with examples of many councils celebrated over the centuries. So if you look in that Mansi that's in the library, that's all of the local councils. It's tremendous, and that is not even a full set. We have to get a full set of Mansi. The ecumenical council, the general council or ecumenical, oikumene in Greek, means household. No, it's this mene. I think that's right. I'll get Father Fleece to confirm that. Oikoumene. All right, oikumene. In transliterated. Oikoumene. All right. It means household in Greek. So it means a household council. Before ecumenism, that was the only term for it. In other words, the only meaning for ecumenical was, except among Protestants, was a general council called by the Pope or approved by the Pope, as a general council. But then the word ecumenism got involved in that. You know what that is. I don't have to tell you. It's abandonment of the Catholic faith. That's what it is. So that's where the word comes from. So let's see, oikumene, yes. The inhabited world. See, that was a term for the whole world, the whole house. It is a meeting of bishops convoked from the whole world for the purpose of judging and legislating concerning ecclesiastical things under the authority of the Roman Pontiff. I said one from the whole world, for in this way an ecumenical council is distinguished from a national council, to which are convoked the bishops of a certain patriarchate, kingdom, or nation, where the patriarch or primate resides, and from the provincial council to which bishops of one ecclesiastical province are convoked, where the metropolitan presides. So we excluded those. By the term convoked, we mean that it is right that all be called, but it is not necessary that all come together, provided that the princes of the church are congregated in such a number that those congregated are considered to represent the Catholic Church. See, so not everybody has to come. As a matter of fact, during wartime and other troubled times, people couldn't come. Various, even expense or health or all kinds of reasons, but they are called. See, and enough have to show up. If 3 show up, you can't have a general council. There has to be, by normal moral standards, a considerable representation of the church.